This is a video that will demonstrate how to assemble a waistband that uses a fold down top and a casing to place elastic into. So this is like an elastic waistband. And first I want to kind of like talk about some of these patterns and just what a casing is. A casing is a fabric tunnel. So it's like a tube that when folded down, it creates that tube when sewn in, and then you can place the elastic in this case, or you can also put a drawstring into that casing and pull it through, and that's how you can create the fit around the waist. What we're going to be doing is we are using a fold down casing. There's more than one way to create a casing. You can use a facing piece, you can use like a strip of bias tape, you can use like a contrasting fabric to create that enclosure on the wrong side of the garment to run that fit piece into. So like, you know, elastic or a drawstring, or you know, if you want to do some ribbon and use that as a drawstring. There's a lot of different materials that you can use to actually cinch in that extra material to create the fit around the waist. You'll also see casings around the wrist of sleeves. So if you have an elastic wristband on the bottom of your sleeve, that's another use of a casing. Sometimes you will also see a casing around the waistline of a shirt or a jacket. I've seen them personally. I have a jacket that uses a drawstring around the waist on a longer coat that's a little bit more sporty of a style. So just know that like casings are not only limited to like the tops of skirts or shorts or pants. They are also utilized, this concept of casing, and running some elastic or drawstring through to create that fit. What we're going to do in this sample is we are utilizing the fold down casing, and it is formed by turning an extension of the garment. So that's the extra space at the top of your pattern. Using this extra fabric at the top of the garment edge, we're going to fold that down towards the inside of the garment to create that casing. So when it's a fold down casing, it just means that it's an extension of the original pattern, so that we're not like creating another seam to have that extra space to create that casing. We're actually folding it down and stitching it into place. So the first thing that we're probably going to want to do is to kind of review our patterns, so we are familiar with what we have coming to us. This is the skirt front. As you can see, this is our original waistline, and so we've added some space in here to accommodate for the width of the elastic, and then the ability to fold that down, and then to also fold down this 1/4 inch fold, so that we have a nice enclosure for that elastic to be strung through. You'll see that exact spacing of the casing is mimicked on the skirt back. We also have some notches on our patterns if you want to cut those out, just to indicate where that fold line is, or where that 1/4 inch fold under is, or for the 5/8 inch seam allowance on the back at the center back to go ahead and close that center back of your skirt. There's also indicating the 5/8 inch seam allowance along the side seam. And just so you guys are kind of orientating yourself to the different parts of the skirt, as you can see that you wanted to cut this pattern on the fold so that when you opened it up you had a definite right and left side of that skirt, and then there's two pieces for the back. So if this is the center front, then you have your side seams on both sides, and those run down ideally to split like your the front and back of the body is what goes on the side seam. So on a skirt it'd be like kind of the front half and the back half of your thigh type of area and hip. So now that we're kind of familiarized with our pattern pieces and what we can expect when we start to sew, the first step that we need to do is we actually need to assemble this skirt. So I'm going to go ahead and take all of my pattern pieces off of my actual patterns off of my fabric that I've already cut and set them to the side. I want to keep them handy just in case I forget what my seam allowances are, or what that fold down space was, or what else I might need to do. So I always keep my patterns handy. What I would recommend doing is you can either like notch out on the side where some of these markings are using your scissors to just snip little clips into the side that doesn't go all the way in to the seam allowance width, which is 5/8, so just a little snip. Or you can use your tracing paper. I did both, but I took my tracing paper and it was red, and I made sure that I placed it on the back side of the sample and transferred those marking lines. And I also just want to kind of put a plug in here that all of the markings that you put on these samples are meant for you. They're meant to help you identify where you need to stitch, where you need to fold, what lines you should match up. They're not for me, you know, to look at when I'm grading, because you know, it's temporary chalk. It would wash out. It's really meant to help you as an individual who is constructing this garment to match things up properly and to help you communicate to yourself what you need to do and where the different markings are on the fabric. So just know that it's up to you what you decide to mark and what you understand to communicate those markings to you best. So if you want to mark every seam allowance, that's totally up to you. If you just want to put little kind of dashes for those markings along the top or on the middle, along the bottom, it's up to you, whatever helps you to remember what stitches you need to do and complete in order to construct this garment as a whole. So again, the first thing that we need to do is we need to assemble the skirt. Now I'm going to start at the center back of my my skirt. These are the back pieces. They were cut 2, so not on the fold, so when I open them up, I have 2 complete pieces here. Now since I cut them, you know, with right sides together, I can actually just leave them together as it is, and then I'm going to go ahead and stitch at that 5/8 inch seam allowance to close that back. So I'm going to go ahead and place my needle and presser foot at that 5/8 inch seam allowance, running the raw edge right along those markings, both on my clear bobbin cover as well as on my throat plate. As a reminder, you guys, a lot of you have those those big magnets that you can set right on top of your throat plate that'll help you keep the fabric in line with that 5/8 seam allowance marking. So I would go ahead and suggest doing that. Make sure that your stitch length is on 2.5, and we're going to go ahead and do some back stitching at the top of this stitch line as well as at the bottom. So I'm just going to stitch all the way along that center back seam at 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then when I get to the bottom, I'm going to do some back stitching here, and then go ahead and pull my sample out and trim those thread tails real short. I'm going to come back up and trim those as well. The next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to attach the front of the skirt to the back of the skirt, the front of the skirt to the back of the skirt along the side seams here. Okay, so what I've done is I've gone ahead and you know, just set this sample so that the right sides are facing me, so that I can take the skirt front, which was on the fold, and place it so the right sides are together. And this is going to be completed in a two stitch process. And as you can see, my back piece, when I set these on top of each other, is a little bit bigger than the front piece, and that's because there's typically more body in the back. You know, that's where your derriere is at, and typically that is more full than on the front. So like the front part of your hips and stuff. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to just start with one side, and we want to make sure that the side seams are matched up. And there was also some notches for that indicated where that hip line typically was. So I'm going to go ahead and match up those notches, and it matched up pretty well just if I went along the top here. And again, we're going to be stitching at 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a couple pins along the side seam just to make sure that my raw edges stay matched up. And a tip that I do is when I'm putting in my pins, I always put them in right at where that stitch line is going to be. So I'm going to insert them along that 5/8 inch marking line, or close to at least. I did some using my my tracing paper. I did some marking somewhat down the side seam, almost to where that hip notch was, but not all the way. So, you know, I have a fairly good idea of where that 5/8 inch is going to be. It doesn't have to be exact, but you want to keep where the stitches are going to take place along that 5/8 inch seam allowance. You want to make sure that that fabric is as flat as can be. Now, you'll also see that there's kind of this like notchy area along the top, and it's shaped like this so that when you fold that fabric back, these lines match up perfectly along the edge here. So what you're going to have to do is you'll have to sew it 5/8 of an inch, then pivot your fabric while keeping the needle in the down position when you hit that fold line, because that's where things kind of switch shape. So again, I'm going to start at the top, lining up my raw edge with 5/8 of a 5/8 inch seam allowance on my markings on my throat plate. And as you can see, like, my fabric is kind of at an angle because I have to keep my raw edge lined up flush with that 5/8. So you might have to just kind of shift your fabric around until you hit that fold line. So I'm going to do some back stitching as I start, and then I'm keeping that 5/8 inch distance until I hit that fold line marking. And then I'm going to keep my needle in the down position, raise up my presser foot, and shift my fabric so that the remainder of this kind of slightly curved hip area can keep with that 5/8 inch seam allowance. And I'm just going to slowly go around that curve to make sure that my line is straight as I can keep it. Alright, now once I hit that hip line notch, I have a fairly straight line the remaining distance until I get to the end here. And as I approach those pins, I'm going to stop and pull them out. And then I get to the bottom of this hem line here, I'm going to do some back stitching. Alright, then raise up my needle and my presser foot and go ahead and trim those threads. So just to kind of give you a close-up of kind of what to expect as you stitch, you're going to be doing a straight line on the top of this casing, and then you're going to stop when you get to that fold line, and then shift directions here by moving your fabric. I'm going to repeat the same process on the other side of my side seam, making sure that everything is matched up with the raw edges. Again, we're going to have some extra fullness in the back side of the skirt just to accommodate for your back side. Alright, I'm just going to make sure the most important thing is that I have those raw edges matched up. And so I'm just going to put some pins in all along that side. I'm going to double check, make sure my notches are matching up, and they are, so that's good news. And I'm putting in those pins, inserting them right at that 5/8 inch marking, so that I know that where I'm going to be stitching at is the fabric is going to be flat. And you might just have to manipulate your fabric a little bit to make sure that your raw edges are truly matched up. Okay, just a couple more pins all the way down the side here, and one at the bottom, and then I can go ahead and start stitching. Now, if you find that you have some slight unevenness when you go to match things up, all that could be is it just could be a small cutting error, especially when you place things on the fold or there's two layers. Sometimes those layers shift a little bit. If you're using a fabric that is very slippery, what I would suggest doing, I mean, we're not using slippery fabric in class, but for the future, what you might want to do is put down your sample, trace around it, do your markings, and then if you need to, cut each piece individually. You'll have to flip your pattern to make sure that you have a right and a left, but just for the future, for your own personal sewing projects, if you're using a fabric such as like silk or rayon, or even a satin polyester that has a little bit of shine to it, your fabric will want to slip around as you cut out those pattern pieces. So it might be good to to transfer the markings with like a tailor's chalk or a marking pen, so that you don't lose shape due to cutting. So if it's small and just very slight like this, that's not a big deal. When you go ahead and press those seam allowances open, things will fairly match up, and you can usually fix all those small minuscule errors when you go to complete the edge of that hem. So when you go ahead and fold that up. So we're not going to be hemming on this sample, but that's just what you can do to kind of combat some of those problems. So I'm going to go ahead and do some back stitching to start this next side seam off. And I'm going to stitch down to that fold line, keeping my needle in the down position, and then I'm going to rotate that fabric and then start the next curved stitch line again. Now make sure that you're going fairly slow around this slight curve, just to make sure that your 5/8 inch markings are following along that raw edge here. Alright, now I've hit that notch area, so I have a fairly straight line from here until the end of my sample. Now if you feel that you know, you're struggling with maybe seeing the video exactly how it is, or where you need to mark your lines at, or how this should look kind of close up, your construction packet has detailed written instructions that also has some images, close-up images of kind of how you need to place your fabric and turn your edges around. And if you haven't printed off that construction packet at this time, I would suggest doing that, so that you have that extra reference. There's also detailed instructions in your textbook, but not as, I would say, simplified and step by step given out. Sometimes they skip a couple steps because they'll assume that you're able to understand how to manipulate your fabric and turn things as you need. So just know that there are a lot of resources available for you if you need them. So what we've done so far is we've assembled our skirt. There's a hole that now you can get into. There's a front and a back, and our side seams are all closed. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually create this casing with this top extension here. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the video, and I'm going to go ahead and go over to my ironing board using the tailor's ham to press open all of these seam allowances that we just created. So I'm not going to video the pressing, but you're going to want to press open your center back seam. You're also going to want to press open your side seams, and you might have to use the tailor's ham to get this curve going right here along the hip line. So after you press, we'll continue with stitching and making this casing.